Thank you everyone for coming back again for the second week of presentations on biblical archaeology. So for anyone who wasn't here last week, my name is Joshua Hanlon, and last week I talked about basically what a biblical archaeology dig is like, what an experience of a dig is like, and what biblical archaeologists do at a dig. This week, as the title slide says, I'll be talking about significant biblical archaeological finds and how they help us understand the Bible. There are tons and tons of these, a lot of different directions you could go in. The ones I've chosen are significant not only because of what they are, but also kind of how they were discovered or the research that's been done with them. So there's a lot of different kind of interesting directions that you can go in there in understanding the work that archaeologists do and the way they research all of these objects. And I did want to say thank you, everyone, for your interaction last week. Very good answering the questions and everything. So hopefully we'll continue that this week as well. One thing you'll notice, and I'll try to mention this whenever it comes up with the finds this week, a lot of these are significant because they gave us kind of physical proof of something that maybe we only had some not so well done written records of in the past. And so that's why a lot of these I've chosen today. So I'll start with, I've kind of broken this into two sections. The first is the Old Testament, a few objects that we found that really tell us a lot about what was going on in the Old Testament, and then the second section is the New Testament, yes. So starting here with the Tel Dan inscription. Now, first question for anyone who was here last week, who remembers what a tel is? City? Okay. A mound, yes, there you go. So yeah, it's a mound that has a bunch of cities inside it, essentially, the ruins of a whole bunch of cities. So this is the Tel Dan inscription because it was found at Dan, which is a city in the north of Israel. And it's also known as the King David inscription. And before I go further into this, I've actually got a video that I'll show you guys that helps explain this a little further. So we'll start with that today.
Standing here in the city of David, the place where 3,000 years ago, King David conquers this city and makes it the capital of his kingdom. And yet, until nearly 4 decades ago, there was a group of scholars who argued that King David never existed, that there was no proof outside of the Bible confirming his existence. Until the year 1993, when an excavation in Israel's north, in a place called Tel Dan, a large stone inscription is uncovered, dating some 150 years after the rule of King David. And this inscription is attributed to a man named King Hazael of Aram. And this King Hazael is himself mentioned in the Bible, in the second book of Kings. And he was in a good mood. Why? Because the inscription tells us that he had just won a decisive military victory. Over who? Over a king from the house of David. And if there's a house of David, that means that there was a King David. Today, consensus among archaeologists and scholars is that there was, in fact, a historic King David. Now, the Bible tells us that King David ruled from Jerusalem. And where was Jerusalem during the time of David? After 150 years of archaeological excavation, the answer is clear. Right here where I'm standing in the city of David, the place where Jerusalem began. Because when you're in the place where the Bible happened, the words of the Bible come to life.
So there we go. So that's a nice overview of what this object is. So as he mentioned there, just give an overview of what he said. This was set up by a king who came in and defeated an Israelite army and then set up this stone. This type of thing was very, very common in ancient times, where kings would go on campaign, and then if they were victorious, they would come back and make all these carvings that either were written words describing what had happened or kind of artistic depictions and pictures that would show them defeating their enemies. And so that's what happened here. This Aramean king came in and defeated the Israelite armies from the king of the house of David. And so what's so interesting about this, and I think this is something that we kind of take for granted today with a lot of our knowledge of the Bible, that we just kind of accept that all of these historical figures were there all along and that this has always been accepted as fact. But until this was found, outside of the Bible, we didn't have other proof for the existence of King David. And so, as he said, there were a lot of people who thought, well, maybe David didn't exist. Maybe it's just something that's in the Bible. But these types of finds are very helpful in kind of adding that context and more historical accuracy to our depictions of these figures. The next couple things I want to talk about here are a couple of seals. So you might be familiar with seals. These are something that a lot of kings would have used on letters or official correspondence throughout their kingdom, and this was a way that they were able to kind of show, me, the king, actually authorized this, and now it's my writing. So I'll start with this. This is the prophet Isaiah seal, and this was actually found together with another seal from King Hezekiah. And these two men were very, very close. They're mentioned several times in the Bible. Actually, Noah, if you want to read a passage for me, please, here. 2 Kings 20, verse 1, if you can look that up. These two men throughout the book of 2 Kings are mentioned multiple times, and because of that, they had a lot of interaction while they were alive, and then the objects that have been found together also show that as well. So in 2 Kings chapter 20, and then Noah, when you find that, you can just let me know here. Do you want me to go ahead? Yeah, 2 Kings 20, verse 1.
In those days, Hezekiah became ill and was at the point of death. The prophet Isaiah, son of Amos, went to him and said, "This is what the Lord says. Put your house in order because you are going to die. You will not recover."
So that's one verse I wanted to pull out. There's a lot of verses where they're mentioned together, but there you can see that their relationship was very close to the point where Isaiah was coming and talking with him as Hezekiah was dying. And I mentioned that because, as I said, these seals were found together. So I'll start here with the Isaiah seal. So this, you can see on this photo here, it depicts, there's one letter missing. So what we have here are the letters, you have Isaiah's name in the middle, and then you have the letters NVY, which are the first three letters of the Hebrew word for prophet. And it's missing one letter there. If everything was there, it would say belonging to Isaiah the prophet. So that's this text that you see here. So they've kind of added it in over here. If that was all there, it would say belonging to Isaiah the prophet. And so it's pretty clear, even though there is one letter missing, most archaeologists and historians and researchers agree that this was from Isaiah the prophet, especially because of where it was found. One really interesting thing about this is the way it was found, and that was through what's called a wet sifting process. So if you remember last week, I showed that one photo of me when we found the dog skeleton, where we started sifting all the dirt that we found because we wanted to get absolutely everything. Well, some stuff is so small. These are only actually about half an inch wide. So if you can imagine that, these are very, very tiny. And they're also the color of dirt, essentially, if you look at these photos here. So very small, basically the color of what they're digging in. So they'll do sometimes what's called wet sifting, which is where you take a big sifter and then you're running water over it just to make sure that anything that is not dirt is easily visible there. And that's how these, along with about 30 other seals, were found as well. And actually this photo on the right is where they were found. So if you've ever seen photos of Jerusalem or the Temple Mount there, it was right in that red circled area there, very close to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They found a whole, it was actually kind of a like a garbage waste dump area, and they just found all of these seals that had been left over there. So that last one was the seal of Isaiah, and then King Hezekiah, who, as I mentioned, they were very close. They also found a seal that says, this one is more complete, as you can see in this photo. This says, belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, and it includes a winged sun. So that's what this symbol in the middle is, if you can see that very easily out there. You got kind of the sun and then wings, and that was kind of a symbol of God's protection because he had kept Israel's enemies from conquering this city of Jerusalem. So these are significant because they give us this physical proof of both the prophet Isaiah as well as King Hezekiah, and then I also just think it's really interesting the way that they were found with so much other stuff there right in the city of Jerusalem. The next one here I wanted to throw in mostly because I wanted to give examples of how recent this work is. So last year, a lot of archaeology digs were canceled. So some archaeologists were left to just doing this to making up for their normal work that they couldn't do. When you have to work from home as an archaeologist, it gets a little difficult. But as I was doing research for this presentation, a lot of people's lists for kind of the most significant finds of 2020, the number one thing on this list were these Judean capitals here. And these are really neat for a couple of different reasons. I've got another video I'll show you that kind of talks about these as well.
You can see the beautiful view behind me, the old city of Jerusalem from the promenade, known as Armon HaNetziv in Hebrew. In English, it's the governor's house.
A few months ago, I directed an archaeological excavation on behalf of the Israel Antiquities Authority and funded by the City of David Foundation, the Ministry of Tourism, and the Jerusalem municipality.
2,700 years ago, during biblical Jerusalem, the times of the Judean kings, a royal estate was located here. This is the time between the Assyrian assault on Jerusalem and the time of the Babylonian conquest. In the course of the excavation, our greatest surprise was when I heard the digging vessels scraped on a large stone, and when we brushed it clean, it was the most beautiful decoration I believe ever found of the capitals decorated in that manner from the First Temple period. And we had a great surprise when, after removing that ornamented capital, we found a second one immediately underneath it.
Oh, הנה עוד אחד. עוד אחד. עוד אחד. זה מבצע אחד וזה. We're in the Israel Antiquities Authority storeroom. Here we have some of the examples of the most beautiful finds that decorated probably the patio or supporting a porch of a palace or a royal villa. I was so excited when we found them, I didn't sleep for 2 nights. The experts say that they are the most beautiful in their composition, in their execution of masonry and design. We're very lucky to have them preserved in this manner. We have mini capitals decorating a window, a base of a beautifully ornamented pillar. On top of it, we could put this decorative capital. The sill was on top of that. I would call that late Iron Age Windows operating system. And it's not by chance that on the 5-shekel coin, we have the impression of the capital just as found in these excavations. Something unique from the kingdom of Judea 2,700 years ago, imprinted on a modern coin in the modern state of Israel.
So there you go. I love seeing archaeologists and historians excited about their finds like that. That's always fun to watch, as you can see how incredible this is. And it really is such a unique thing if you're just, because you've got to imagine as an archaeologist, you're just digging in the dirt and you never know at what point you might actually find something. So up until then, it's just been layer after layer of dirt that you're removing. And you're kind of always hoping that eventually you'll hit something cool and interesting that makes for a neat discovery. So when you do, it's a really big deal. But to kind of expand on why this is important, so that was a really good overview of kind of what the object is. Nicole, actually, if you don't mind reading in 2 Kings 20, verses 12 and 13, so just a little past where Noah was reading earlier. You can read those 2 verses, 2 Kings 20, verses 12 and 13, and we'll explain a little bit on why this is important.
At the time, Merodach Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent Hezekiah letters and gifts, which he had heard of Hezekiah's illness. Hezekiah received the messengers and showed them all that was in his storehouses, the silver, the gold, the spices, and the fine oil, his armory, and everything found among his treasures. There was nothing in his place or in all his kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them.
So there he's talking about the wealth of Israel at this time, which is a really interesting thing because at this time, Israel was a vassal state to Assyria. And so they were actually paying basically yearly tribute to them. And so for many years, historians have looked at this and wondered, well, how is that possible that they were this vassal state and paying all this money to Assyria? How could they still have had all this wealth and been building these incredible buildings that would have had these types of capitals in them and everything? But this shows that it actually was happening. You can see these, in almost pristine condition, very good condition here that they found these, and it shows that there were these big building projects going on. and it lines up with what those verses were talking about, that there would have been all this wealth and this really incredible architecture to show off to these visiting kings at the time. Now we'll go on to our final find from the New Testament area that I wanted to talk about, and that is this burnt scroll of Leviticus. And I have another video to show for this as well to talk about the process for researching this.
Recognition, researchers have resurrected one of the earliest known versions of the Old Testament. They used it.
Oops. Sound there for some reason. Let's try this again.
From a Hebrew scroll burned beyond recognition, researchers have resurrected one of the earliest known versions of the Old Testament. They used a new digital reconstruction technique that they believe may be invaluable in revealing words from other previously unreadable finds. In research published in Science Advances, computer analysts at the University of Kentucky in Lexington virtually unwrapped a roll of parchment that had been reduced to a lump of charcoal in a burning synagogue 1,500 years ago, without ever actually touching the artifact.
First, we capture the 3D shape of the layers of the scroll in a process called segmentation. On the left side of the screen, the software moves through the scroll, image by image, tracing the shape of a single scroll wrap. On the right, we see the 3D model that this produces. Next, we extract the ink from the data in a process called texturing,
revealing the text on the scroll.
However, because the surface is curved, it's difficult to read all of the text from one viewpoint. The flattening stage of our pipeline converts this textured 3D surface into a flat plane so that the text can be more easily read. To produce the best results, these 3 steps must be performed on one small section of the scroll at a time.
Each section is then merged together, producing a single consolidated image that shows the full text, that turned out to be verses from the book of Leviticus. Religious scholars in Israel who analyzed the text said it's the earliest known copy of a central book of the Torah exhumed from a holy ark, one that's identical to the text printed in most versions of the Hebrew Bible today. The scientists plan to make this digital reconstruction technique freely available, which may prove useful for forensic experts and intelligence agencies looking to recover words from texts damaged by fire or shredding.
Now, I don't know about you, but that blows my mind to see how they were able to recover the information off of this scroll. And that technology is definitely beyond my understanding. I do think it's really neat. As I was researching this, they've made that openly available for other archaeologists or anyone doing research, as they mentioned at the end, who could use this type of technology in their line of work. And so I think that's really cool. They kind of went open source with that. But yeah, they were able to take this completely burnt scroll and essentially digitally unfold the whole thing and get the text off of it. And then it lines up perfectly with what we have in the Bible today and connects very nicely with things like the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of the other earlier biblical, medieval era texts that we have as well, and kind of continues that way. Basically, historians can look back and connect all of these different translations and texts up and see how we got to the Bible that we have today. So I think that's just really incredible to see that technology, and then also, the fact that we have such a consistent record of the Bible going back to ancient times. So now we'll move into some New Testament finds here, and there's lots of fascinating work that's always done with this era of the Bible. One thing, this is kind of just a broad overview that I'll start with here, and that's kind of historical speculation and the work that's done in Israel and the Holy Land. So this is something that if you ever go to Israel, you'll definitely notice this. There are lots and lots of sites that people try to connect up specifically with the life of Jesus, because essentially what you have is a pretty small area in the country of Israel where Jesus lived and did his work and his miracles and his ministry and then died. And you have 3 massive religions. You've got Judaism, you've got Islam, and you've got Christianity that are all interested in connecting these sites up as their kind of holy places, essentially, where pilgrims can go and worship, and where they can pinpoint and say, this, for instance, this photo here is said to be the tomb of Jesus, where Jesus was buried. And so there's a lot of kind of push then to to identify these sites and connect them up with the historical records so that people can go there and say, this is what happened. Now, the problem with that is it's very hard to 100% say with certainty, yes, this is this site. So for instance, this tomb of Jesus, the reason that this has been identified for so long as the tomb of Jesus is because the Constantine, the first Roman emperor, the first Christian Roman emperor, he sent a delegation to Jerusalem about 300 AD, so this was a few hundred years after the time of Christ, and they went researching to pinpoint exactly where Christ was buried, and as they did their research, this is the location that they identified that people had been passed down as basically tradition at that point, that this is where Christ was buried. And you can see this quote then from an archaeologist, historian at the bottom. It says, "We may not be absolutely certain that the site of the Holy Sepulchre Church, which is this church that's built around what is supposed to be Jesus' tomb, is the site of Jesus' burial, but we certainly have no other site that can lay a claim nearly as weighty, and we really have no reason to reject the authenticity of the site." And that's true with a lot of these places. So this photo here is supposed to be the home of Jesus in Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. And again, it's a very similar situation. There's kind of historical tradition. There's some early, within a few hundred years or more after the time of Christ, there are people who said this is kind of where Jesus grew up or where he was buried. But from a historical perspective, they say, this is kind of our best guess. Based on the research we've done, there are a lot of things that lead us to believe this could be where it is, but it's not 100% certainty. And so then you get kind of this strange situation if you go to Israel, where you have all these pilgrims and church groups and lots of people from these different religions going to these sites and treating them as if they are kind of with 100% certainty the place where Jesus was buried or where he grew up. And that always struck me as a little odd. I guess kind of the feeling like you have to have this really firm commitment to this one physical location where something may or may not have happened. I think a lot of that might just come from my kind of denominational Protestant background, where there's much less focus on kind of physical objects and buildings. And so depending on your kind of religious background, I think that can affect a lot of it as well. But that's something that a lot of people, when they go to Israel, notice this is just, everywhere it seems like there's a church of whatever minor biblical thing may or may not have happened here, and they try to prove that with as much proof as they can find. Another find here from the New Testament area, this is super interesting to me. This is a crucifixion victim. So everyone very familiar with the crucifixion of Christ, obviously a well-known event from the Bible. But for a very, very long time, until a few decades ago, there had never been a crucifixion victim found from the Jesus lifetime, that era of ancient Roman history. And so because of that, it was very difficult to know exactly what crucifixion was like. We had written records, but you're never entirely sure how accurate those are. But that was all changed when they found this crucifixion victim in 1968. He was convicted of a political crime. He was found actually with a sign with him, very similar to what the Bible says about Jesus. It had his name on it. This photo here is actually of his heel bones that with a nail driven through them. And then on the right there is basically a depiction of what, based on the way that they found his body and the things they found with it, what they think his crucifixion would have been like. It's still a little unclear exactly how every victim was crucified. It might have changed depending on the person and the whole situation surrounding what the crucifixion was about. So that can depend on the person. But mostly this just proves that crucifixion was very much a real punishment that actually happened during this period. And then more importantly, a lot of scholars and a lot of people had disputed the fact that someone crucified would have been buried in a tomb like Jesus was, like the Bible says Jesus was. But they found this body preserved in a tomb, so this is proof then that people who were crucified could have been, they weren't just dumped somewhere, along the side of the road or whatever, or just in an unmarked grave. They would find proof of them later on. So finds like this, again, things that we maybe kind of take for granted from the Bible, that when you have more of this kind of historical context to it, adds a lot to it as well. This next find is what's known as the Jesus boat. To me, kind of any old preserved boats are just super interesting, like the fact that something can sink and then the water doesn't completely destroy it and people can find it either thousands of years later just is pretty crazy to me. And that's what happened here. So this was a boat in the Sea of Galilee. There was a period of a few years, a few decades ago, where the Sea of Galilee had a severe drought, and so the water receded quite a bit, and a couple of fishermen who were also kind of amateur archaeologists discovered this remains of this boat on the left. And this boat has been dated to right around the time of Christ, so it's very, very similar to the types of boats that the different apostles who were fishermen would have been using when Christ called them to his ministry, and it's also very similar to the type of boat that Christ and the apostles might have been in during the famous storm on the Sea of Galilee when Jesus calmed the storms. That photo on the right there is a depiction of what it would have looked like completely whole. You can see kind of the mast sticking up in the middle. So that's what it would have kind of looked like originally. This is what was found and has been preserved in a museum in Israel today. This is one of the photos actually that I took when I was in Israel a few years ago. So some of these finds are kind of very well known, and they've preserved them enough that people can go visit them in Israel. But I just think that's really cool to see kind of what that stuff from the time of Christ like that, like a boat, has existed to today. This is the Pilate stone, and I've got a video that I'll play for you on this one as well that talks a little bit about this.
I'm walking at the location where Herod's palace once stood. Now, Caesarea Maritima was Herod's best attempt at ensuring the Roman domination of the land of the Jews. It was the official capital of Judea, and it was the year-round home of Pontius Pilate. Now, Pilate did maintain a home in Jerusalem, but he was seldom there unless it was Passover, where he was there to make sure that the crowds stayed under control. In 1961, an ancient building stone was found with Pontius Pilate's name carved on it. This archaeological find caused great excitement and is universally accepted as authentic. It gives me chills just thinking about its significance. The stone was placed by Pilate to honor the then Caesar Tiberius. Tiberius was the adopted son and heir to Caesar Augustus. Tiberius is mentioned in the book of Luke. It was in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius that John the Baptist began his ministry. And it was thought that it would have been Tiberius's face that was on the coin when Jesus used the coin to answer the Pharisees' trick question, saying, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." The Pilate stone reads as follows: "To the august gods, this Tiberium, that is, the temple in honor of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated." And what you see today in Caesarea Maritima is a copy. The original is viewable at the Israel Museum.
So as he mentioned there, yes, the original has been preserved in the Israel Museum, which is just this incredible, like, mind-blowing collection of ancient artifacts in Israel. If any of you ever have the opportunity to go over there, it's kind of one of those must-hit spots in Israel to see just so many incredible artifacts on display. But the significance of this really comes down to, proving that Pilate was a historical figure, not only that Pilate existed, but also his position at the time as prefect of Judea, which is what the Bible says about him. So obviously he kind of played a central role in Christ's trial and crucifixion, and so finding this really helps add more of that historical context to what was going on at that time, and proving that Pilate was very much a historical figure who did these building projects and was ruling at that time. This is Peter's house in Capernaum, another place that if you are ever in Israel, you will most likely visit. Those couple of photos on the right actually are from when I went there a few years ago. So this is kind of similar in a lot of ways to Jesus' tomb and Jesus' house that I was talking about a few minutes ago, where this is scholars' best guess for being Peter's house. And they think that this is where Jesus lived while he would have been in Capernaum, which is a town on the Sea of Galilee. Actually, the majority of Jesus' miracles, a lot of his work was right around the Sea of Galilee area in Israel. And this is where Jesus would have likely stayed if this is Peter's house in Capernaum. A lot of evidence has been found pointing to the fact that this was turned into a church right after the death of Christ. So that's one reason they think this was Peter's house, because it quickly became essentially a house church after Christ died, sort of depicted in the book of Acts when you see kind of the early Christian church and some of what was going on there. One reason they think that is there's been a lot of graffiti, kind of words etched into the walls that mention Jesus and talk about blessings and things like that from Jesus in the walls of this house. And then about 300 years after it was built, the building that you see today here is actually an old Byzantine church. And this type of design was used to designate kind of important places from early Christian history. And so one reason that they think this was Peter's house is because there's been this consistent record of treating this as a holy site and then building these churches on top of it. And if it wasn't an important early Christian site, why would they have gone to all of that trouble? And today, actually, there's this kind of like viewing platform that's built on top of it there, and then underneath that platform is the actual sort of archaeological original home that you can see down there. So I'll read this quote then. This is about that house. So this says, biblical archaeology discoveries are not cut and dry cases, though there is no definitive proof in this instance that the house ruin uncovered by the excavators actually is the ancient house of Peter. There is layer upon layer of circumstantial evidence to support its importance in early Christianity and its association with Jesus in Capernaum and his foremost disciple, Peter. Were it not for its association with Jesus and Peter, why else would a run-of-the-mill first-century house in Capernaum have become a focal point of Christian worship and identity for centuries to come? And so this kind of gives a really good insight into the way that historians work in kind of taking clues as much as possible, both from the things they find there on the site and then just what they know about the time and the history since then, and thinking about, if a site has been kind of set apart and churches have been built there, and this is something that people have treated for thousands of years now as a site that was special, there's probably a reason for that. It's not just random. So that's kind of how they dive into this and try to treat some of that research. And then finally, to just kind of finish things out here for us, this is a quote from Dr. Steve Ortiz, who actually led the dig that I did in Israel a few years ago that I talked about last week. And he says, archaeology is that one discipline that anchors the event in the Bible in real time-space continuum. And so I hope that's an idea that you've gotten from these last couple weeks as I've been presenting, that by finding these physical objects, you're able to add all of this context to what's happening in the Bible. And you kind of can connect it up with all of these other historical events happening in that time period, in that area of ancient history. And it really helps enlighten our understanding of what was going on at the time. And I also want to encourage you to use all of this wealth of archaeological data that I've given just a few examples from here, but there's so much more than what I've presented here. And use it as an encouragement in your faith in God, and knowing that the archaeological record, the historical record, lines up with what the Bible says. And so that's not something that you need to be concerned about or afraid of, to enter into debates, and you don't need to question your faith over this type of thing, which is something that has happened a lot over the years. Someone will put something forward and Christians will say, oh, well, does this somehow disprove something related to the life of Jesus, or something, an Old Testament figure or king or something along those lines. So you can be confident in your faith that the archaeological and historical record lines up with what happened in the Bible, and be willing to go out and spread your faith based on that partially.